The air inside the tiny Quonset hut was thick and warm, smelling of hot metal, dry hay, and burning pine. It was a pocket of impossible safety, holding steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside, the Montana blizzard raged into its third continuous day. For 72 hours, the wind had not dropped below 50 miles per hour, driving the temperature down to a lethal 35 below zero. Walter Erickson, all 11 years and 80 pounds of him, sat on an overturned bucket, watching the small thermometer his father had once used for engine calibrations. The needle was his only god, and it was holding. The curved steel walls around him vibrated with the constant assault of the wind, and every few minutes, the massive oak beams of the outer barn groaned under a weight of snow that no one had calculated. He was sealed in, a boy inside a metal can, inside a wooden box, buried under a world of white. His survival was a series of small, repeated rituals. Every 30 minutes, he checked the flue on the barrel stove, a rusty oil drum he had converted with a stolen hacksaw and sheer determination. Every hour he scraped a tiny circle of frost from a screw head on the wall to check the integrity of the seal. He knew his resources down to the last unit. He had enough seasoned wood for another 48 hours if he was careful. 27 cans of beans, a 5-gallon jug of water now half empty, and 3 precious candles. He had built this refuge based on his father's old engineering diagrams, a structure designed to withstand shrapnel, now repurposed to fight the cold. The physics were sound. The structure was strong. But as another gust of wind hit the barn with the force of a freight train, he felt a tremor not in the floor but in his own bones. Suddenly the stove coughed. A puff of greasy black smoke billowed from the open grate, momentarily stinging his eyes and filling the small space with the acrid taste of soot. Walter didn't panic. His father had taught him that panic was a luxury. He knew instantly what it meant. The makeshift chimney pipe, running precariously up through the hayloft and out a gap in the barn roof, was becoming obstructed by the accumulating snow and ice. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer his dad had warned him about, was trying to find its way back in. He scrambled to the stove, his small, chapped hands adjusting the damper with a practiced twist, reducing the airflow just enough to force the smoke back up the pipe. The black cloud receded, but the message was clear. His engineered sanctuary had a flaw, and it was slowly turning against him. It was in that moment of tense silence, with only the wind and the crackle of the fire, that he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a frantic, muffled banging from outside, somewhere beyond the steel wall of his hut. It was rhythmic, desperate, and human. Walter froze, every muscle tensed. He had not heard another human voice in 3 days. The sound was close, impossibly close, meaning someone had made it to the barn. He crept to the heavy steel door he had fashioned, pressing his ear against the cold metal. The wind nearly drowned it out, but then it came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice broken and raw, shredded by the gale. "Please, is anyone in there? Help us." The voice was familiar, laced with an authority he recognized even in its desperation. It was Ed Larson, the farmer from the adjacent property who had watched him build this shelter for weeks, laughing from the seat of his warm tractor. The man who had told everyone at the town diner that the orphan rat was digging his own grave. Now that same man was on the other side of the door, his mockery replaced with the primal terror of a father. "My daughter, she's not breathing right. We saw the smoke from your pipe. Please, for the love of God, we're freezing." The words were a physical blow. Walter looked from the door to his dwindling pile of firewood, then to the single thermometer on the wall. The numbers in his head were unforgiving. Opening that door meant letting the storm inside. It meant his carefully calculated 48 hours of survival would be cut in half, maybe more. He stared at the thick wooden bar he had set as a lock, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting commands. His father's rule, trust the structure, not the people. The physics don't lie. But the ragged, desperate plea for a child hung in the air, a variable he had never factored into his equations. The banging stopped. A heavy, sickening thud echoed through the steel, as if a body had just collapsed against the outside of his wall. Then there was only silence, a silence even more terrifying than the screaming wind. Walter's small hand, trembling slightly, reached for the wooden bar. His creation was meant to keep the cold out. But he was now faced with the decision about who and what he was locking in. In a moment you will see the choice he made, and how a structure built from ridicule became the only thing standing between an entire community and a frozen grave. This video was created with the assistance of artificial intelligence, but the human touch is what gives this story its soul, the strength, the message, and the way it's told. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like so more people can find this story, and comment below where you are watching from. The answer to what happened next begins not with the storm, but with the day everyone told him he was a fool. 6 months earlier, the same patch of Montana land was a world of dust and heat, not ice. The wind was a constant presence, but it carried the scent of dry grass and distant cattle, not the blade of Arctic cold. In Glacier County, seasons didn't change gently. They were overthrown in violent coups. Summer was a dry siege, and winter was an invading army. The abandoned Larson barn stood on a low rise. Its red paint faded to a pale ghost of its former self, its massive oak frame groaning under the relentless sun. It was a monument to a failed expansion, a place the community had learned to ignore, and it was here, in the long shadows of late August, that Walter Eriksson arrived, carrying nothing but a tattered canvas sack and the weight of a name nobody in town respected. He was not yet a builder or a survivor. He was simply a fugitive, a boy of 11 running from the only home he had left. That home was the St. Jude's Home for Boys, a grim institution managed by the county and run with an iron fist by Mr. Horace Whitfield. It was less an orphanage and more a labor pool, where boys were hardened by neglect and rented out for cheap farm work. Walter had endured it for 2 years after his parents were taken by a swift, brutal flu. But the final straw was Whitfield's plan to send him to work the mines in Butte, a place from which boys rarely returned healthy. So he ran. His only inheritance was a small, oil-stained notebook filled with his father's engineering sketches, diagrams of trusses, load-bearing walls, and the beautiful, simple physics of a Quonset hut, a structure his father had once helped design for military use. The notebook was his Bible, and the principles within it were his only creed, a language of angles and forces that made more sense than the cruelties of men. His first days were a blur of hunger and caution. He discovered the old barn was truly abandoned, a forgotten asset in a property dispute between Ed Larson and the bank. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decaying hay and rust. In a dark corner, half buried under debris, he found a heavy wooden chest. It wasn't treasure, but something better, a set of old, worn tools, a hammer with a chipped handle, a dull-toothed saw, a heavy iron pry bar, and stacked against the far wall were the very things from his father's drawings. A dozen curved corrugated steel panels left over from a silo project that never finished. At first, they were just shelter from the wind. He hadn't yet conceived of the blizzard. He was focused on the immediate problem that gnawed at his belly, an emptiness that no amount of engineering could solve. With his stomach cramping, Walter walked the 3 miles into the small town, a collection of a dozen buildings huddled around a single main street. He knew begging was useless, and stealing was a line he wouldn't cross. His father's memory demanded more. His only currency was labor. He entered Gable's general store, a place that smelled of sawdust, cured leather, and pickle brine. Mr. Gable stood behind the counter, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of weary suspicion. Walter kept his eyes low, his voice barely a whisper. He offered to stack firewood, sweep the floors, unload the next supply truck, anything. He wasn't asking for money, just a few cans of food, enough to last a week. He pointed to the shelf with the canned beans, the simple request hanging in the dusty air between them. Mr. Gable stopped polishing a glass jar and looked down at Walter, his gaze sweeping over the boy's worn clothes and thin frame. He didn't see a child asking for help. He saw a problem. He saw a runaway from Whitfield's institution, a piece of county property that was out of place. The store owner let out a short, sharp sigh, a sound of profound irritation. He told Walter he didn't run a charity. He said giving a boy like him a handout would just encourage him, and that the next thing he knew, stock would start disappearing from the shelves. The accusation was quiet but landed with the force of a slap. He gestured toward the door with his chin. "Go on, get, before I call Sheriff Brody and have him drag you back to Whitfield myself." The finality in his tone was absolute. A door slammed shut not just on food but on any notion of community. Walter walked out of the store, the bell on the door mocking him with its cheerful jingle. A hot flush crept up his neck, the warmth of humiliation a bitter substitute for the meal he had hoped for. He could feel the eyes of other customers on his back, their silence a form of agreement with Gable. In that moment, the world clarified into a brutal, simple equation. There were no saviors, there were no open doors. There was only what you could build yourself, what you could calculate and reinforce against the pressures of the world. The memory of his father's voice surfaced, a calm anchor in his rising panic. People fail, Walt. They get scared, they get greedy. But steel and wood, they follow the rules. Trust the structure, not the people. The physics don't lie. That evening, back in the cavernous gloom of the barn, the rejection from Gable became the catalyst. The hunger was still there, a sharp pain in his gut, but it was now fuel for a cold, clear resolve. He wasn't just hiding anymore, he was preparing. He unrolled his father's notebook under the weak light of a sliver of moon coming through a crack in the roof. The Quonset hut diagrams were no longer just theoretical drawings. They were a blueprint for survival, a small defensible space within a larger, indifferent one, a world he could control, governed by the laws of thermodynamics and load distribution, not by the whims of men like Gable and Whitfield. He would build a place so strong and so smart that he would never have to ask anyone for anything again. He ran his small, dirty fingers over the drawing of the hut's curved roof, a design meant to deflect explosions, but which he would use to shed the weight of snow. He looked from the paper to the stack of heavy steel panels gleaming faintly in the darkness. The task was monumental. Each panel weighed more than he did. The bolts were rusted tight, the ground was uneven, and he was utterly alone. He had no power tools, no assistance, and only the fading light of summer to work with. The physics were sound, but the labor required was punishing, a mountain of effort for a boy who had been denied a single can of beans. The coming winter didn't know his name, but he would build a fortress against it, one painful, exhausting step at a time. The world had said no, so he would construct his own answer. September bled into October, and the Montana air acquired a sharp, metallic edge. Walter's days fell into a grueling rhythm, a cycle of labor and survival dictated by the sun. He woke before dawn, the cold floor of the barn seeping into his thin clothes, and spent his mornings gathering fallen branches from the creek bed, his hands raw and perpetually splintered. He learned to move like a ghost, skirting the edges of farms to scavenge fallen apples from untended orchards or dig for potatoes left behind in harvested fields. This was his primary source of food, the forgotten scraps of a world that had forgotten him. Sleep was a luxury taken in the hayloft, buried deep in the musty, dry hay for warmth, his senses always on high alert for the sound of a truck on the gravel road or the bark of a dog. He was a creature of the margins, living in the spaces between properties, a silent observer of a life he wasn't allowed to join. His most valuable finds were not edible. In a rusted-out pickup truck half swallowed by weeds, he discovered a tattered copy of a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers field manual from the 1950s. The pages were brittle and water-stained, but the diagrams were clear, showing how to build temporary bridges, reinforce structures against blasts, and, most importantly, how to properly insulate a shelter using nothing but earth and canvas. He spent hours tracing the lines with a dirty finger, the precise angles and load calculations a familiar comfort. It was his father's language. He could almost hear his voice, a low rumble over a blueprint-covered table. Everything has a breaking point, Walt. Wood, steel, people. The trick is to know the numbers. The numbers don't have opinions. This became his mantra, a shield against the gnawing loneliness that crept in during the long, silent nights. The wound on his left hand was a constant throbbing reminder of his limitations. While trying to pry two rusted steel panels apart with the iron bar, a jagged edge of metal had sliced deep into his palm. He had no antiseptic, no clean bandages. He washed it in the icy creek water and wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. But he could feel the heat spreading from the wound, a dull, persistent ache that traveled up his arm. The work didn't stop. He knew that any sign of weakness, any illness that would force him into the open, would mean a swift return to St. Jude's and the waiting cruelty of Mr. Whitfield. The fear of that man was a far more potent force than the infection. So he worked through the pain, his movements becoming more deliberate, his jaw set against the feverish haze that sometimes clouded his vision. His isolation was not total, but every interaction with the outside world was a fresh wound. He learned to watch the town's rhythms from a distance, noting when the supply trucks arrived at Gable's store. He would wait, hidden until the driver was inside, then offer to help unload the heaviest sacks for a dented can or a broken bag of flour. Sometimes it worked. More often, he was met with suspicion. One afternoon, a railroad maintenance crew was working on the tracks that ran parallel to the Larson property. Walter watched them for hours from the cover of the trees, fascinated by the simple genius of how they used leverage and teamwork to replace heavy sections of track. He saw how they braced the rails, how they used shims to level the load, lessons he filed away in his mind. He was invisible to them, a shadow learning the mechanics of a world that refused to see him. The accumulation of small cuts, both physical and emotional, was leading to a breaking point. He was constantly hungry, the scavenged food never quite enough to silence the ache in his stomach. The nights were getting colder, the single blanket he'd found offering little comfort against a wind that now carried the first hints of snow. He saw the lights in the farmhouses, saw the smoke curling from their chimneys, and the warmth of those distant homes felt like a personal insult. He remembered his own home, the smell of his mother's baking, and the solid presence of his father. That memory was a fire inside him, but it was a fire that could easily turn to ash. He was losing weight, and the fever from his hand was making him clumsy. He knew he was running out of time. Winter was not a season. It was an enemy, and it was advancing. The final blow came on a Tuesday, a day so cold his breath hung in the air like a ghost. Driven by a desperate hunger, he walked back to Gable's general store, determined to offer a full day's work for a proper bag of groceries. He didn't even make it to the door. Ed Larson was there, loading feed into his truck, and he saw Walter approaching. Larson stopped, a smirk spreading across his face. He called over to another farmer. "Hey Frank, look, it's the barn rat. Heard he's building himself a little nest in my old junk pile." The other man laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Whitfield ought to keep a better leash on his animals." The words hit Walter with a physical force, stopping him in his tracks. They weren't just words, they were a verdict, a public declaration of his worthlessness. As if summoned by the commotion, Mr. Gable appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of sour disapproval. He pointed a thick finger at Walter. "I told you to stay away from here. You've been sneaking around, haven't you? I'm missing 2 jars of preserves. It was you." The accusation was baseless, a lazy assumption born of prejudice, but it was delivered with the weight of fact. Walter stood frozen, his throat too tight to form a denial. The shame was a hot liquid filling his lungs. He was surrounded, judged, and condemned without a trial. Larson took a step toward him, his expression hardening from mockery to menace. "You hear the man? Get out of here before I call Sheriff Brody and have you thrown in a cell where you belong." He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, not looking back, the laughter of the men chasing him down the dusty street. He ran until his lungs burned, and the stitch in his side was a searing knife. He didn't stop until he was back in the cavernous, dusty sanctuary of the barn, the massive doors closing out the world. He collapsed onto the dirt floor, the adrenaline giving way to a cold, hard clarity. His father's rule echoed in his mind, no longer a piece of advice but an undeniable law of nature. Trust the structure, not the people. The physics don't lie. People did. They lied, they laughed, they judged. They were the storm he had to survive. He sat there for a long time as the afternoon light faded, the chill of the barn floor seeping into his bones. The humiliation didn't break him. It forged him. It burned away the last remnants of hope that someone might help, that kindness was a resource he could find. There was no help coming. There was only the knowledge in his head, the tools in the chest, and the stack of cold, indifferent steel panels against the wall. He looked at them now with a new purpose. They were not just shelter. They were his answer. They were the walls of a new world, a world with a population of 1, a world governed by logic, temperature, and force, a world where no one could ever call him an animal again. With slow, deliberate movements, he got to his feet. He walked over to a bucket of rainwater he had collected and plunged his infected hand into the icy water, biting his lip against the sharp, cleansing pain. He unwrapped the dirty rag, looking at the angry red swelling without flinching. It was just another problem to be solved, another variable in the equation. He dried the hand on his pants and walked to the corner where he kept his father's notebook. He opened it to the page with the Quonset hut schematic, the clean, confident lines a stark contrast to the chaotic cruelty of the town. His mission was no longer just about surviving the winter. It was about proving them all wrong. The work would be brutal, but it would be his. Every bolt tightened, every panel secured, would be an act of defiance. The first snows were only weeks away. He had to begin. The humiliation from town did not curdle into despair. It crystallized into a plan. Back in the echoing silence of the barn, Walter laid his father's notebook on the dusty floor, the pages illuminated by a single, defiant beam of afternoon light slanting through a crack in the wall. The diagrams of the Quonset hut were no longer just an intellectual curiosity. They were a command. He saw the elegant curve of the roof not as an architectural feature, but as a shield designed to shed the crushing weight of snow. He saw the corrugated steel walls not as mere barriers, but as a membrane that would hold a precious pocket of warm air against a universe of cold. The idea was not born of genius, but of pure, distilled necessity. He would not just hide in the barn, he would build a fortress inside it, a smaller, smarter world governed by the laws of thermodynamics, not the laws of men. His mind, sharpened by weeks of hunger and observation, broke the problem down into its four essential components, the four horsemen of a Montana winter: cold, wind, water, and air. The massive, drafty barn itself would be his first line of defense, a colossal breakwater to shatter the main force of the wind. The 10-foot air gap between the barn's outer walls and his planned inner hut would act as a powerful layer of thermal insulation, a buffer zone where the temperature would be brutally cold, but static. The snow, a form of water, was an enemy that could crush him, but also an ally that could insulate him, and the curved roof was designed to manage its weight. The final element was air. He needed to breathe, and his fire needed to breathe, but every cubic foot of cold air he let in was a battle lost. The entire design was a delicate, dangerous balancing act between suffocation and freezing. The first step was a monument to futility. He stood before a single corrugated steel panel, a 12-foot-long sheet of 200-pound steel, its edges sharp with rust. He was 80 pounds of bone and resolve, and the panel might as well have been a mountain. He pushed, he pulled, his bare hands slipping on the cold, dusty metal. The panel didn't budge. Frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at the back of his eyes. For a moment, the laughter of the men in town echoed in his ears, a chorus of doubt. He kicked the panel. The hollow boom, a pathetic sound in the vast space. Then his father's voice, a calm memory from a workshop long gone, cut through the noise. "Don't fight the weight, Walt. Use it. Change the angle of the force. Leverage." It was always about leverage. He retrieved the heavy iron pry bar from the tool chest. It was a simple machine, a force multiplier. Jamming one end under the panel and using a block of wood as a fulcrum, he threw his entire body weight onto the bar. The metal groaned in protest, a high, screeching complaint that set his teeth on edge. The panel lifted only an inch, but it was an inch of victory. The process was agonizingly slow, a painstaking sequence of prying, sliding, and repositioning that took the better part of 3 days just to move the first 4 panels into position. The infected wound on his left hand throbbed with every movement, a constant dull fire that spread up his arm. He worked through the pain, gritting his teeth, his sweat mingling with the rust and dirt on the floor. Each secured bolt was a small act of rebellion, a quiet refutation of the world that had cast him out. He assembled the first 2 wall sections, creating a fragile arch of steel. The work was a brutal education in physics and fatigue. He learned that a single unsecured panel could act like a sail in a sudden gust of wind through the barn, threatening to tear the entire structure apart. He learned to brace everything with salvaged 2x4s, creating a crude but effective wooden skeleton to support the steel skin. One afternoon, exhausted and dizzy from the fever in his hand, he misjudged the placement of a roof panel. It slipped from its temporary support, crashing down with the sound of a thunderclap just inches from where he stood. He scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, the air thick with dust. He sat for a full hour trembling, staring at the fallen panel, a stark reminder that the physics he trusted were unforgiving of mistakes. The near disaster forced him to be more methodical. He spent the next week reinforcing the wooden frame, driving scavenged nails with a rhythmic, determined pounding that echoed through the empty barn. He began the painstaking process of sealing the structure. He used strips of a rotten canvas tarp he'd found, stuffing them into the seams between the steel panels. He then packed the gaps with handfuls of dry, brittle hay, creating a dense, insulated barrier. The hut began to feel less like a collection of parts and more like a single solid object, a steel cocoon taking shape in the gloom. He insulated the floor with a foot-deep layer of sawdust and wood shavings from a collapsed section of the hayloft, creating a dry, springy surface that would keep the ground's chill at bay. It was a slow, monotonous task, but with each sealed crack, he felt a growing sense of control. The heart of his creation was the stove, fashioned from an old 55-gallon oil drum. Using the dull hacksaw, a task that took 2 full days and left his shoulders screaming in protest, he cut an opening for a door and a hole for the chimney pipe. He mounted it on a bed of flat stones to protect the wooden floor from the intense heat. The chimney was his greatest challenge. It had to vent the smoke safely out of the hut, up through the cavernous space of the barn, and out a gap near the roof's peak, 30 feet above. He pieced it together from sections of rusted stovepipe he found in a junk pile, securing it with baling wire. It was a precarious, ugly thing, a fragile artery connecting his warm, sealed world to the cold, hostile one outside. Everything depended on it drawing correctly. With the structure sealed and the stove in place, the moment for the first test arrived. His hands trembled slightly as he crumpled a piece of newspaper and laid a small pile of kindling inside the barrel. He struck a match, the flare of light seeming impossibly bright in the dark interior. The kindling caught and a small hungry fire began to crackle. For a few minutes it was perfect. A wave of dry, radiant heat pushed back the damp chill, the first real warmth he had felt in weeks. The smoke flowed obediently up the pipe, a thin grey ribbon disappearing into the darkness above. He watched, mesmerized, a surge of pride swelling in his chest. It was working. He had bent the rules of the world to his will. Then it went wrong. A sudden gust of wind rattled the main barn, and a swirl of greasy, black smoke puffed back out of the stove's door. He coughed, his eyes watering from the acrid sting. Another puff followed, thicker this time, and then a steady, lazy curl of smoke began to leak from the seams of the stovepipe. The small hut started to fill with a choking haze. The physics had betrayed him. The draft had failed, and the carbon monoxide his father had warned him about was now a guest in his sanctuary. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled to smother the small fire with a handful of sawdust, his mind racing. The chimney's design was flawed. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. He threw open the heavy steel door he'd rigged, gasping in the clean, cold air of the barn as the smoke billowed out. The warmth he had created bled out in seconds, leaving the hut as cold as it was before. He stood there, shivering, looking at the silent, smoky stove. The open loop was no longer a theoretical problem on a diagram. It was a tangible threat. How could he keep a fire alive for days on end? If a simple change in wind could turn his shelter into a gas chamber, he had built walls to keep the cold out, but he had inadvertently designed a perfect trap. The blizzard was coming, and he now knew that his greatest enemy might not be the storm outside, but the air inside his own creation. The failure of the stove was not a defeat, it was a diagnosis. Shivering in the sudden, invasive cold of the barn, Walter stared at the smoke-stained oil drum as if it were a disobedient animal. The problem wasn't the fire, and it wasn't the stove. It was the physics of the draft. His makeshift chimney was too short, and its angle too shallow to create a powerful enough thermal column to overcome the chaotic air pressure shifts caused by the wind howling around the massive barn. The smoke, seeking the path of least resistance, was choosing to flow back into the hut rather than fight its way out into the gale. He needed to get the pipe higher, straighter, and clear of the turbulent air rolling off the barn's peak. It was a simple solution on paper, but a terrifying prospect in reality, involving a 30-foot climb up the barn's decaying internal structure. The next 2 days were a blur of calculated risk. He lashed the iron pry bar to his back and began the slow, treacherous ascent up the hayloft ladder, its rungs slick with generations of dust and moisture. His infected hand throbbed with every grip, a fiery protest that he systematically ignored. From the loft, he had to navigate a web of massive oak beams, each one coated in a fine layer of what felt like ice. He worked with a terrifying economy of motion, securing himself with a length of old rope, his small body a fragile silhouette against the grey light filtering through the barn's high broken windows. He disassembled the faulty sections of stovepipe, hauled them up one by one, and began reassembling the chimney, forcing it through a higher gap in the roof. His only tool for securing it was baling wire, which he twisted tight with numb, clumsy fingers, the metal biting into his skin. The effort paid off. When he lit the next fire, the draft was clean and strong, pulling the smoke up and out with a satisfying low roar. A steady, reliable warmth began to fill the steel cocoon once more. But in solving one problem, he had created another. The thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke that had once dissipated in the rafters was now a clear, vertical plume rising from the barn's roof, a stark grey signal against the bruised purple of the autumn sky. It was a flag planted in a conquered territory, announcing his existence to the entire valley. He had built his sanctuary in secret, but now his very survival depended on a constant fire, and that fire was a beacon. He knew with a sinking certainty that his isolation was over. It was only a matter of time before someone came to investigate. The first visitor was Ed Larson. He didn't come on foot. He drove his massive John Deere tractor right up to the barn's main doors, the engine's diesel rumble a hostile intrusion into Walter's quiet world. Walter watched through a carefully drilled peephole as Larson dismounted, his face a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The farmer circled the barn, his eyes fixed on the smoke. He kicked at the foundation, tested the main door, and then stood there for a long time, just staring, a smirk slowly forming on his lips. He didn't try to get in. He didn't have to. He got back on his tractor and drove away, and Walter knew the man was heading for town, carrying a story that would be far more damaging than any physical threat. He was no longer a ghost. He was now the local spectacle. Within a week, Walter Erickson became the laughingstock of Glacier County. Larson's story, embellished with each telling at the town diner, painted a picture of a feral child, the barn rat, building a tin can coffin for himself. Men would drive past the Larson property slowly, pointing and laughing at the faint trail of smoke. The narrative was simple and cruel. He was a foolish, stubborn runaway playing at survival, a problem child who would either freeze to death or burn the whole barn down. The ridicule was a constant low-grade assault. It meant he had to be more careful when scavenging, his movements now watched by suspicious eyes. Mr. Gable at the general store now refused to even look at him, shooing him away from the porch like a stray dog. The wall of social isolation was now reinforced with mockery. The gossip inevitably reached the ears of authority. One crisp afternoon, Sheriff Brody's patrol car crunched up the gravel lane, its arrival as jarring as a gunshot. Brody was a tall man, his face worn down by the perpetual weariness of his job. He didn't yell or threaten. His voice was calm, almost bored, which made his words all the more terrifying. He explained the legalities in simple terms. Walter was trespassing on bank-owned property. He was an unregistered minor, a runaway and a liability. "I've got a report to file, son," Brody said, his gaze sweeping over Walter's small, defiant frame. "And Mr. Whitfield at the home has been asking about you. I'll give you until the first real snow sticks to the ground. You gather your things and be gone. If you're still here after that, I'm coming back and I'm taking you in." The ultimatum was a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic indifference. Walter watched the patrol car disappear, a cloud of dust in its wake, and a cold dread settled in his stomach, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had a deadline, one measured not in days, but in the whims of the weather. As he stood there, frozen by the weight of his predicament, an old railroad maintenance truck rumbled past on the adjacent service road. The driver, An elderly man with a face like a road map named Silas slowed down. He'd been watching Walter's progress for weeks during his routine track inspections. He didn't stop or say a word, but as the truck passed, something small and dark was tossed from the window, landing softly in the grass. Walter waited until the truck was gone before cautiously approaching. It was a cast-iron stove damper, heavy and perfectly functional, a small anonymous gift of efficiency. He installed the damper that evening, the solid piece of metal a stark contrast to his own flimsy, makeshift parts. It gave him precise control over the stove's airflow, allowing him to burn his precious firewood far more slowly and safely. It was a tiny miracle, a piece of anonymous humanity in a world that had offered him none. The gift hardened his resolve. He would not run. He would not be taken back to Whitfield. He would finish what he started and face the storm, both the one in the sky and the one represented by Sheriff Brody's badge. He began working with a feverish intensity, his every action now a race against time and the falling barometer. He spent every daylight hour hauling and stacking firewood inside the barn, just outside his hut's door, creating a small mountain of fuel. He calculated he had enough for 4, maybe 5 days of continuous burning. He made one last desperate trip for supplies, managing to trade 2 hours of hard labor, clearing a drainage ditch for a farmer on the far side of the county who didn't know his story, for a sack of potatoes and a box of candles. The temperature was dropping fast, a sharp, biting cold that promised snow. As he trudged back, dragging his meager supplies on a makeshift sled, Ed Larson and another farmer passed him in a pickup truck. They slowed down just long enough to laugh. "Stocking up for the winter, rat," Larson yelled, his voice full of derision. "Don't worry, we'll come dig your frozen body out in the spring." The truck sped off, kicking up a spray of icy gravel. Walter just lowered his head against the wind and kept walking, the insult another log on the fire of his defiance. That night, the first flakes began to fall. They were small and hesitant at first, then larger, thicker, coming down in a silent, determined curtain. He retreated into the Quonset hut, the steel walls already humming with the vibration of the rising wind. He checked his supplies one last time: 32 cans of beans and soup, the sack of potatoes, 10 gallons of water, the box of candles, and the mountain of firewood just outside. He slid the heavy wooden bar across the inside of his steel door, the solid thud echoing in the small space. The sound was one of finality. He was sealed in. The radio he'd salvaged from an old tractor crackled to life with a burst of static, a voice cutting through the hiss grave and urgent. It spoke of an Arctic front, a Siberian express, a blizzard of historic proportions, with wind chills expected to drop to 50 below zero. He sat on his overturned bucket, listening to the announcer list the counties under a state of emergency. Glacier County was at the top of the list. The wind outside was no longer a whistle, it was a physical roar, a deep, guttural sound of a world coming apart. The massive oak beams of the barn began to groan under the strain, the sound of an old ship in a hurricane. Sheriff Brody's deadline no longer mattered. The laughter of the men in town was gone, swallowed by the storm. There was no one coming for him. There was no escape. There was only the hut, the stove, and the numbers. He looked at the thermometer his father had given him. It read 68 degrees. Outside, the world was turning to ice. He had built his ark, and now the flood was here. The first warning was not a clap of thunder, but a crackle of static from the salvaged tractor radio, its wires jury-rigged to an old car battery. 7 days before the sky fell, a tinny voice cut through the hiss, speaking of a weather pattern coalescing over the Arctic Circle. The announcer used a term that sounded like something from a war movie, a Siberian express. It was a mass of impossibly cold, dense air, and it was rolling south with unusual speed and ferocity. While the rest of Glacier County heard a forecast for a heavy snow, another inconvenient winter storm to complain about at the diner, Walter heard a declaration of war. He didn't panic. Panic was a luxury. Instead, he switched off the radio to conserve the battery and began a new, more urgent phase of his work. The focus shifted from construction to logistics. He spent the entire day hauling the last of his scavenged firewood, stacking it not just inside the barn, but in a carefully organized pile right against the outer wall of his Quonset hut, minimizing the distance he would have to travel in the crippling cold. 3 days later, the sky itself became a warning. The brilliant, sharp blue of a Montana autumn was gone, replaced by a strange, bruised ceiling of yellowish-gray cloud that seemed to press down on the valley, absorbing all sound. The usual chatter of birds in the tree line went silent. The field mice that had been a constant nuisance in the barn disappeared. Even the wind, a constant companion, seemed to be holding its breath. Walter noticed the change in pressure, a heavy, dead feeling in the air that made his ears ache slightly. He had read about it in his father's old engineering manuals. It was a sign of a massive atmospheric shift. He spent that day on his final sealing operation, meticulously packing the last remaining seams of his steel hut with a mixture of mud and hay, creating a thick, ugly paste that would freeze solid and become as hard as concrete. He worked with a grim, focused efficiency, his small body moving with a purpose that belied his age. The world was giving signals, and he was one of the few who was listening. The mockery arrived 48 hours before the first snowflake. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a single afternoon, and a treacherous, invisible sheet of black ice formed on every exposed surface. Walter was outside, struggling to drag a heavy railroad tie he had found toward the barn's main doors, intending to use it as an internal brace. That's when Ed Larson drove by on his tractor, the heated cab a small glowing bubble of warmth and comfort. He slowed, not out of concern, but out of amusement. He watched Walter slip and fall on the ice, the heavy timber pinning his leg for a moment before he could wriggle free. Larson didn't offer help, he just laughed, a loud barking sound that carried easily in the cold, thin air. "What's the matter, Rat?" he yelled over the engine's rumble. "Trying to lock yourself in before the boogeyman gets you?" The farmer shook his head, a picture of smug certainty, and drove on, carrying the story of the crazy orphan boy's latest folly back to town for a fresh round of ridicule at the diner. 24 hours before the storm hit, the snow began to fall. It was not the violent, wind-driven assault he had been preparing for, but a quiet, almost gentle descent of large, heavy flakes. They drifted down lazily, coating the dead grass and the rusted metal of the barn in a pristine blanket of white. To the families in the valley, it was a picturesque first snow, a signal to light the fireplace and settle in for a cozy evening. To Walter, it was the final tick of the clock. He retreated into the barn, pulling the massive, groaning doors shut for what he knew would be the last time. Inside his Quonset hut, he performed his final inventory: 32 cans of food, 10 gallons of water, 1 box of candles, and enough firewood, by his most conservative estimate, to burn the stove continuously for 96 hours. He slid the heavy wooden bar across the inside of his steel door, the solid thud a sound of absolute finality. He was sealed in. The world outside could do its worst. As night fell, the character of the storm changed utterly. The gentle snowfall became a horizontal blizzard, the wind shifting from a mournful whistle to a deep, guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The massive oak frame of the old barn began to groan and pop under the strain, the sounds of a great wooden ship being torn apart in a hurricane. Ice pellets, driven by 70-mile-per-hour gusts, hammered against the barn's siding with the sound of machine gun fire. Inside his steel cocoon, Walter was insulated from the direct assault, but he could feel the vibrations through the floor, a constant, deep tremor that made the very air hum. He sat on his overturned bucket, his eyes fixed on the small thermometer screwed to the wall. The needle held steady at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero, and it was still falling. The contrast was no longer just a matter of comfort. It was the difference between life and death. The point of no return came just before midnight, and it was announced by a flash of spectral blue light. Through his small peephole, Walter saw the entire blizzard-choked landscape illuminated for a single silent second. A moment later, a deep, muffled boom rolled across the valley, a sound that was felt as much as heard. A power transformer, somewhere down the main road, had exploded under the strain of the ice and wind. The faint ambient glow from the distant town vanished, plunging the world into a profound and absolute darkness. The valley's fragile electrical grid was dead. Every furnace, every electric heater, every well pump in every farmhouse for miles around had just gone silent. Their modern world had failed. Walter felt a tremor of fear, But it was quickly replaced by a cold resolve. He struck a match and lit a single candle. In the flickering, primitive light, his low-tech fortress suddenly felt like the most advanced piece of engineering on the planet. Now, the snow became the true enemy. It was no longer just falling. It was accumulating with an unnatural speed, driven by the relentless wind into massive drifts. He could hear it piling up against the barn, the sound a soft, sinister hiss that was slowly burying him alive. Around 2 in the morning, he was jolted by a loud, splintering crack from above. A beam in the main barn roof, overloaded with the weight of more than 4 feet of dense, heavy snow, had given way. He held his breath, listening, but the roof held. The structure was failing. He moved to his peephole, scraped away the frost and peered out. He saw nothing. Not the far wall of the barn, not the faint outline of the hayloft, just a solid, featureless wall of white. The snow had filled the interior space, drifting in through the barn's many gaps. Then he heard it, a deep scraping groan followed by a heavy final thud. It was the sound of a 10-foot snowdrift pressing against the main barn doors, sealing them shut. The cage was closed. There was no way out. He was now utterly alone, a boy in a metal can, inside a wooden box, buried under a world of white. The constant roar of the wind was his only companion, a sound so immense it felt like the voice of the planet itself. He checked the flue on his stove, the metal warm and solid beneath his small, chapped hand. The draft was holding, a fragile column of hot air fighting its way up the chimney against the fury of the storm. He looked at his small pile of potatoes, his neat stack of canned beans, and the flickering candle that cast his own long dancing shadow against the curved steel wall. He had done it. He had built a world that worked, a pocket of warmth and order in the middle of a universe of chaos. But as the barn groaned again under a particularly violent gust, a cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. The physics were sound, but he had never calculated for a storm of this magnitude. His creation was about to be tested beyond anything his father's diagrams had ever imagined. Walter's hand hovered over the thick wooden bar, his knuckles white against the dark grain. The physics were absolute, an unforgiving god of numbers and heat loss. Opening the door was a violation of the first principle of his design, to maintain a sealed thermal envelope. His carefully calculated 96 hours of firewood would be cut to less than 50. The air, currently stable at a breathable 66 degrees, would be contaminated with a blast of air cold enough to freeze lung tissue. Every instinct, every lesson drilled into him by his father's diagrams screamed to leave the bar in place. Trust the structure, not the people. But the silence from the other side of the door was louder than the storm. The silence was the sound of a child, Sarah Larson, who might already be dead. He looked at the thermometer, then at the door. His father had taught him to solve for the variables, and a dying 8-year-old was a variable the diagrams had never accounted for. With a single decisive movement, he lifted the bar. He braced his small body against the steel door as he pulled it inward, and the storm entered with the violence of a physical invasion. A wall of wind and fine, sharp ice crystals blasted into the hut, instantly extinguishing his candle and sending a vortex of ash swirling from the stove. The temperature on the wall thermometer plunged 30 degrees in less than 10 seconds. Ed Larson stumbled in, half carrying, half dragging a woman wrapped in a frozen blanket, who in turn was clutching a small, still form. Larson was a ghost of the man who had mocked him, his face a mask of frozen tears and desperation, his beard caked with ice. He collapsed onto the sawdust floor, his words ragged and broken. "Help her. Please, son. Help my Sarah." Walter didn't answer. He fought the storm, throwing his entire weight against the heavy door to force it shut, the steel groaning as he slid the wooden bar back into place, sealing them inside a new, more complicated version of hell. The immediate crisis was air. With 4 people now crammed into the 12 by 20-foot space, the oxygen was being consumed at a terrifying rate. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of wet wool, fear, and the metallic tang of extreme cold. Worse, the blast of Arctic air had cooled the chimney pipe, weakening the draft. A thin, greasy trickle of smoke began to leak from the stove's seams, a sure sign of carbon monoxide buildup. While Margaret Larson frantically rubbed her daughter's frozen hands and feet, trying to coax life back into them, Walter ignored the panic. He grabbed the iron poker, his movements precise and economical. He threw open the stove door, accepting a blast of heat and smoke, and expertly stoked the fire, making it burn hotter, fiercer, forcing a powerful thermal column up the chimney to clear the ice obstruction. He then cracked the small floor-level vent he'd built, letting in a tiny, controlled stream of life-giving but dangerously cold oxygen. The second crisis was fuel. The hotter fire, necessary to combat the cold and maintain the draft, was consuming his precious firewood at twice the calculated rate. By the second day, the neat stack inside the hut was nearly gone. The main supply, a small mountain of wood, was just outside the hut's door, but it was in the main barn, which was now a dark, treacherous landscape of chest-deep snowdrifts and unseen debris. Leaving the shelter was a suicide mission, but staying meant the fire would die and they would all freeze. He tied one end of a rope around his waist and the other to the hut's door handle. Handing the slack to a stunned Ed Larson, he gave his first and only command of the ordeal. "Don't let go." Then he opened the door and plunged into the churning, pitch-black blizzard inside the barn, a small boy navigating a frozen interior sea to retrieve the fuel that would keep them all alive. For the next 48 hours, the Quonset hut became a self-contained world operating on the edge of catastrophe. Time was measured not by the sun, which had vanished, but by the rituals of survival. Every hour Walter checked the chimney's drawer and adjusted the vent. Every 2 hours, he made the perilous journey with the rope to fetch more wood. He rationed the food, giving the Larsons the cans of soup while he chewed on raw potatoes, saving the fuel it would take to heat them. Ed Larson, a man used to commanding acres of land and teams of workers, sat on an overturned bucket, silent and humbled, his frost-bitten hands wrapped in rags. He watched the 11-year-old boy he had called a rat move with the quiet, grim authority of a ship's captain in a hurricane. He saw the methodical way Walter managed the fire, the way he monitored Sarah's breathing, the way he never wasted a single movement. He was witnessing not madness, but a terrifying and profound competence that shamed him to his very core. On the morning of the 4th day, the world fell silent. The wind, which had been a constant deafening roar for 72 hours, simply stopped. The sudden absence of sound was more jarring than the noise itself. After a long moment, Walter scraped the frost from his peephole. He saw a sliver of impossible blue. The storm was over. It took them 2 hours to dig their way out, not from the hut, but from the barn itself. The main doors were buried under a 12-foot drift. They escaped through a high window in the hayloft, emerging into a world transformed, a landscape of alien white shapes under a painfully bright sun. The air was clean, still, and 30 degrees below zero. In the distance, not a single light was on. Not a single plume of smoke rose from any chimney. The valley was silent, beautiful, and dead. The final tally was brutal. The Siberian Express of 1989, as it came to be known, was the deadliest storm in Glacier County's recorded history. It lasted 72 hours, claimed 12 lives, and wiped out nearly half the region's livestock. The power grid would take 2 weeks to repair. In the midst of the widespread devastation, the story of the 4 survivors from the abandoned Larson barn spread like wildfire. It was a story that didn't make sense. A family saved by the very boy the town had dismissed as a feral outcast. The narrative was carried not by gossip, but by the raw, unsparing testimony of Ed Larson himself. At the first town meeting, held in the cold, generator-lit diner, Larson stood before his neighbors, his hands bandaged, and confessed his own arrogance and cruelty. He told them how he had laughed, and how that laughter had nearly cost him his daughter's life. He described, in painstaking detail, how Walter's tin can coffin was the only piece of engineering in the entire county that had not failed. The town's reaction was a slow, dawning wave of collective shame. Men who had laughed along with Larson now stared at their coffee cups, unable to meet his gaze. Mr. Gable, the store owner who had accused Walter of theft, suddenly found his inventory records to be of immense interest. The official investigation that followed, prompted by a state rural agent who heard the story, uncovered something far darker. The agent looked into Walter's history, which led him straight to the St. Jude's Home for Boys and the corrupt practices of Mr. Horace Whitfield. Within a month, Whitfield was arrested. his reign of abuse and exploitation brought to an end by the unintended consequences of a blizzard. The system that had failed Walter was finally held to account. The Larsons, their lives forever changed, did the only thing that felt right. They took Walter in, first as a foster child, then, as soon as the paperwork could be filed, as their own son. He was no longer the barn rat, the ghost in the margins. He had a room, a seat at the table, a family. His status inversion was not one of power, but of belonging. The legacy of his creation, however, extended beyond the barn. Spurred by donations from a guilt-ridden and inspired community, the Erickson Efficient Build Program was established, a county-funded initiative to construct small, insulated emergency shelters on remote farms, using the same principles of Walter's design. 1 year later, Walter stood in a newly built workshop beside Ed Larson, the scent of fresh-cut pine replacing the old smells of rust and hay. On a workbench lay his father's oil-stained notebook, open to a clean page. Beside it, new blueprints were laid out, not for a secret refuge built from defiance, but for a community's shared safety. He was no longer just building to survive a world that had rejected him. He was building to improve a world that had, against all odds, finally let him in. The physics his father had taught him hadn't just saved his life. They had rebuilt a community, proving that the strongest structures are not made of steel and wood, but of knowledge, resilience, and the difficult, humbling grace of a second chance.